Okay, so here is I'm going to have a quick run through the first module of my course, Astrology for Grimoire Magicians, which is setting out the basics really of things that you need to know, some of the underlying principles, and some of the thinkers and scholars who it's where I'm getting this information from basically. So I'm going to go through the first module in here, which is Archaeology of Astrology, but you'll see that it's really setting up a conversation that gets into, what we mean by time and space, how fate, or what we used to call the weird in the Anglo-Saxon world, is how it works, what it is and what it isn't. Also, the sort of magical cosmology that how the Hellenistic magicians and practitioners understood the world and reality and how it worked. Also, the principles of the sublunary sphere, how the elemental structure interacts with the planetary arrangements. I'd call the next one Introduction to Luminaries, but we're going to touch on some of the luminary stuff now. That's really much more of a development of that. And then the Seven Princes is where I finish this part one. As you can see, it's not a traditional astrology course. I'm not going to go through what the signs mean. I'm not going to go what the houses mean and all that kind of stuff. That's natal astrology. And if you want to know that, there's tons of other courses out there which is much better suited to that. There is an expectation here that you're going to know what the zodiac signs are. There is an expectation that you're going to know some of the basic principles. So whilst I don't have an expectation that you're going to understand the mechanics of astrology, you do need to know some of the things like the signs and the planet glyphs. That's basically it. I'm not going to go into that. I'll expect you to know that, but the rest of it I will explain. Okay, so part one, first module, and the first section of this is magical reality, because you need a philosophical foundation to get into these ideas, to understand the heritage, where they come from, the systems that they were generated within, and how we can adopt and use them nowadays. So my starting point for a lot of this is Alfred North Whitehead's observation that most of European or Western philosophy is really footnotes to Plato. What that means is that you really need to understand what Plato said and his main ideas. So let's have a quick look at that now. Astrology is maths. So in Plato's Republic he says, we should consider the decorations in the sky to be the most beautiful and perfect of visible things, as they embroidered on a visible surface. But we should consider their motions far inferior to true motion, those which are really fast or slow as measured by true numbers, which trace out true geometrical figures, all in relation to one another, and these are things which cannot be seen, but only grasped by reason and thought. So Plato here is really leaning into that Pythagorean idea that everything is maths, and if you really want to understand what's going on, you need to understand the mathematical principles that inform reality. So this is based on this idea of the invisible and the sensible world, or the intelligible world and the sensible world. What I've done in the diagram here is try and plot out Plato's map of how reality works. The bottom half there, the sensible world, is what we know instinctively. It's the objects and physical things that surround us, and Plato described these in his allegory of the cave as being the shadows that are cast by the real things which exist in the intelligible world. So, as above, so below. As magicians, we are interested in this because our realm of activity is the sensible world, and we try to influence the intelligible world through things like rites and spells and ceremony and ritual, where we manipulate physical things in the sensible world with a view, the focus to affecting those things that exist in the invisible world so that they can then come back and affect things in the sensible world, the outcomes, the intent that we're trying to achieve. So this principle is probably quite intuitive to a lot of practitioners, but I want to give us some language to use as we start exploring this idea of there being physical objects and also invisible things, and the interaction and relationship between those two things. That red line, if you like, in the middle is representing the practitioner who tries to straddle both worlds. And this is what Agrippa's getting at in his books of occult philosophy. This is the virtues of the elementary world. What he's talking about is the physical objects and the values that some of these have in the invisible world, and how we manipulate those physical things to have that type of effect. That's what all these lists of correspondences are, and sympathies. And this idea of sympathy and correspondences is absolutely fundamental to Goetia, because we use physical objects to influence that which is invisible. Right. And our language for doing that is mathematics. So some basic principles then. We've always watched the skies. Our earliest and most important stories are about the stars, heroes, mythology, all that kind of stuff. And from mathematics to mythology, it's all come from observing the stars and the intuitions that we've had from that relationship. So let's explore this. Let's give ourselves a bit of a timeline so that we understand what it is that we're talking about. So on the right hand side here is where we are in the 21st century. And going backwards to that last line, to that line on 500 BCE, this is the era of, the Renaissance, where the Grimoires are being written and where modern astrology comes from. What we're interested is in the period before that, the pre-Christian influence on these ideas. And so where I want to start is right at the beginning, in the Stone Age. 2.3 million years ago. And if you think about this proportion of time where we're just starting to use tools and manipulate stone to create things that we want to last, we start to observe. And obviously the main things that we observe are the sun and the moon, the luminaries, and the stars at night. These are the things that we're watching. These are the things that, by the time we get to the Bronze Age, the Mesopotamians are starting to have enough gathered observations and information about it that they can actually start to make predictions about what is going to happen. And because of their interest in prediction, that's why things that happen out of the ordinary are so interesting to them, and where they get the idea of omens from. We're then going to cover what was going on in parallel in Egypt, and although it began to be informed by Babylonian star lore and their observations as well, for a long period of time has its own separate development. So we're going to look at some of the Egyptian stuff as well. And then where we're going to finish is where these things come together, which is the great Hellenic synthesis that happens after Alexander the Great. So let's start in the Stone Age. And we know that these observations were taking place at quite an early stage because of the work of Alexander Marshak, who was an American researcher who studied something called the Aurignacian culture, which was, as you can see there, is all around Europe, 47 to 41,000 years ago. And one of his finds was these carvings on bone and stone that seemed to follow 28-day calendars. And from that, he realised that they were mapping the lunar months. So it seems that our first understanding of time, of things going on above us, of these other objects, was both the moon and that 28-day cycle, probably pertinent for fertility given the similarity to the female menstrual cycle. But also from the architecture, we know that obviously the sun had a massive importance as well, from the round temple of Stonehenge to the pyramids in Egypt. They all seem to be aligned to the solar and lunar objects. However, we've now found older architecture as well, haven't we? So we have Göbekli Tepe, which dates back to the end of the Younger Dryas era. And it would seem that this round temple is actually focused on the star Sirius, which is fascinating, really, given the importance of that star. Now, it is the brightest object in the sky, so it's possibly what linked them to it. But it also had a huge importance in other cultures as well. So let's start in Mesopotamia. And the first thing that I want to draw your attention to is probably not something you've given a lot of thought to, if you've given any thought to astrology at all as part of your practice, which is the pole. And this observation that everything was turning around a particular point in the sky. So this idea of a pole and everything orbiting around it was fundamental to how the Mesopotamians saw reality. And this urge for everything to circulate, to orbit around this point, began to get called necessity. So the next character I want to introduce you to is Frans Koeman, who's a Belgian archaeologist, and he wrote several amazing books, if you're interested in this thing. But the one that I'm going to be starting pulling from now is Astrology and Religion Among the Greeks and Romans. In that, there's this line which I've quoted below: from the leading fact established by them, namely the invariability of the sidereal revolutions, the Chaldeans had naturally been led to the idea of a necessity superior to the gods themselves, since it commanded their movements, and this necessity which ruled the gods was bound a fortiori to hold sway over mankind. Alright, so let's unpack that a little bit. The invariability of the sidereal revolutions, what does that mean? So it means that it was predictable. By observing this rotation, the Babylonians and the Mesopotamians in general started to identify predictability in these patterns. They knew that there were certain stars that were always in the sky, and there were other stars that seemed to disappear. They also observed the wandering stars, which we now call the planets, and that they moved in a different way to these other objects in the sky. So by making these observations, they started to align their lives with these movements of the sun and the moon and the planets. Space and time became both predictable and fundamental to how they behaved and how they planned. So what we've got here now is a Babylonian star map. In the centre we have the constellation known as the Wagon. It was the most important constellation. Now we call this constellation something different now. Part of that constellation, we call it the Big Dipper, Ursa Minor. This constellation was of fundamental importance to the Babylonians, and its association was with a funerary wagon that would carry the dead body. So already we see this combination of what happens to the dead and what happens in the sky. These two ideas are fundamental to how astrology came together at the very earliest level. This link between what happens to us after death, and these visual symbols in the sky of the gods, and more importantly of necessity. So as they were observing these things moving around them, they started to divide this ring into sections, and they did it by identifying the stars that made up those sections and giving those star groupings names, which is where we get the constellations from. But it's important to realise which order this is done in. It's done to measure out sections of the sky, because the Mesopotamians began to realise that these different sections of the sky seem to predict certain things happening, and that strange things happening in those sections of the sky seem to predict unique events, which they called omens. So these divisions of the sky, they fell upon 12 30-degree divisions, and which is where we get the ring of the zodiac from, and the 12 different zodiac constellations. Now, what's also important to realise is that the most important stars for the Mesopotamians were those that were always visible in the sky, the circumpolar stars. But they also became aware that there was other stars that dipped below the horizon and disappeared, only to reappear at later dates. And here, this horizon line gives us the first glimpse of an idea of an underworld or another place. But this other place is in the sky. So whilst it dips below the horizon, it's still seen as being out there. Alright, and this is where we get some of these confusions from ascent into the underworld, and the terminology gets a little bit confusing, but this is where it comes from, this idea. Alright, so we have the zodiac, the 12 signs of the zodiac, which is the contributions made by the Mesopotamians. They start this whole philosophy off of being able to predict, first of all, what's happening in the sky, that would then predict things that happen on the earth, and the unusual things that happen in the sky were also predictors of things that would happen on the earth, diseases, wars, that kind of stuff. Now, in parallel to this, we have stuff going on in Egypt, and here I want to quote Chris Brennan, who has written a fantastic book called Hellenistic Astrology. And if you want to learn more about this stuff, it's a have-to-have book. You need to read Hellenistic Astrology by Chris Brennan. It's got everything you need to know in it. Okay. He says in that the Egyptians were particularly focused on the rising and culmination of stars associated with the decans. So the decans are a different way of dividing that circle up. In early texts, the decans were said to mark or designate which hour of the night it was when they would rise over the eastern horizon, and while in later texts the decans marked the hour of the night when they culminated overhead in the sky. The focus on the diurnal rotations, that's during the day, when the stars and planets rise, culminate and set each day, is often thought to imply that the Egyptian use of the decans acted as a precursor to the later Hellenistic doctrine of the 12 places, which we call the 12 houses now in modern astrology. So what's Chris getting at here? Well, again, we return to the circle and the line, but we're going to understand it in a different way now. Here, the left-hand side, the ascendant, represents the eastern horizon. And for that section of the journey, from the eastern horizon when it appears to its culmination at the very top, the zenith, right above our heads, this is the ascendant line, which we use for things like talisman elections and image elections and things like that. This is where this idea comes from Egyptian thought, and it's also used for the sun in terms of the stations that the sun makes. So the eastern horizon at dawn, noon, sunset, and midnight. This idea of the 4-station cross is why it appears on gravestones as the soul does its circuit. It's the same idea, it's the circle and the cross. This contribution and the idea of particular stars associated with these places is the Egyptian contribution that we're going to be looking at in a lot more depth in later parts of this course, when I look at the spirit list from the Grimoire Verum and how it aligns with what gets called the Ostanese Decan list. Okay, so you've got these two parallel, informing each other, but also developed in parallel ideas of the Egyptians using the decans and the stars for timekeeping on a day-to-day basis, and then the contribution of the Mesopotamians, the mathematics that they developed, the predictability, but also the zodiac ring, which the Egyptians realised that they could overlay their decans onto that zodiac ring, and so this is where this combination starts to happen. But the great synthesis really happens in Greece. And this takes us to the period of time where Alexander the Great creates the first world empire. And it's because of this conquest that lots of different ideas are circulated around culture and science and maths in particular, but astrology becomes the great synthesis of those things. During this time, we have migration, and this chap, Berosus Chaldaeus, he moves to Greece, and by around about 280 BCE, he is teaching astrology in Greece. And what we start to see develop is this bifurcation, yet again, within magic happening, between two different ways of using it. One is the horoscope, the natal horoscope. Horoscope's a Greek word. It basically means the hour of the ascendant, and it was about creating natal charts for specific moments, people, places, events, buildings, cities, anything like that. A natal chart could be produced, and you could use that then to forecast events that would happen in the native's life, whatever that native might be. Secondly, we get this other use of astrology developing, which is what informs theurgy. This aspect is the one that we're going to be more interested in for the purposes of this course, because it's this bringing together of physical objects, manipulating them through rites and ceremonies to affect the invisible, but also for the invisible then to affect the practitioner, and for the practitioner to become more divine in the process. This is what theurgy is, this is where it comes from, and this is really what informs Goetia as we know it now. What's also really helpful to bear in mind as well is the fact that Mesopotamia and Egypt are obviously part of this old Eastern Mediterranean, North African, Levant kind of development that's taking place. Greece was on a slightly different trajectory because it's from the Indo-European line, that the stuff that came from the migrations that came from Iran and went round the back end of the Black Sea and then come back round. These are Indo-European stories and myths where different things were important. And so the Greek ideas were only informed by the Mesopotamian and Egyptian stuff after Alexander the Great's invasion and conquest. Prior to that, it's much more influenced by the developments that are going on with things like the mythology that develops around horses and the Indo-European steppe civilizations. As such, Greek thought and Indian thought were constantly in interplay with each other. And so there are ideas that come from the Indian developments within astrology that then become adopted by the Greeks as well. And we see it in modern astrology with stuff like the lunar nodes, reincarnation, remediation, where planets are out of dignity in your chart and stuff like that. So this is me just doing my due diligence and pointing out the fact that there was other influences affecting these ideas too. And that's Hellenistic astrology. We've got this early Stone Age tracking of what's going on in the stars and the sky and the sun and the moon that influences Mesopotamian mathematics and the cult of necessity. The fact that there is this force above the gods that directs what the gods do. That then becomes combined with Egyptian astrology and becomes informed by their work around the ascendant and culmination, what becomes the Bohemian fixed stars. And also, I've not really touched on this, but also the carving of gemstones that starts with scarabs. If you want to know more about that, check my book out, The Deep Black of Forever. Those then get taken by Greece post Alexander the Great and combined with the ability to make natal charts and Indo-European mythology and the impact of Indian research and developments in those other ideas around reincarnation and remediation and stuff like that. Now the next and last big idea that I want to introduce you to is this, which is the Thema Mundi. The Thema Mundi is the first technical thing really that I need to introduce you to, and this is understood as the natal chart of the cosmos. This is the birth chart of reality. Now, I've deliberately positioned it in the way that I have it. In fact, let me put a different diagram on because that's a bit easier to read. Okay. So the green line in the middle represents the horizon line. And at the birth of the universe, we see that the moon was in Cancer, the sun was in Leo, Mercury was in Virgo, Venus was in Libra, Mars was in Scorpio, Jupiter in Sagittarius, and Saturn in Capricorn. This is important because this explains why the moon rules Cancer, why the sun rules Leo, and why Mercury rules Virgo. And as you learn these a bit more, you'll start to see that that is also reflected into these other signs that I've not put the planets on. So just like Capricorn, Aquarius is ruled by Saturn, Pisces is ruled by Jupiter, Aries by Mars, Taurus by Venus, Gemini by Mercury, and the two luminaries only rule one sign each. Moon in Cancer, Sun in Leo. This is important for so many reasons. First of all, because it explains the planetary rulership of the signs. This is why those signs rule those planets rule those signs. On top of that, it also explains why in ancient astrology, Cancer and Capricorn were held in such great esteem. These are known as the gate signs. Cancer was known as the gate of man, and Capricorn as the gate of the gods. Why is that? Okay, so we get the summer solstice in Cancer, we get the winter solstice in Capricorn. Cancer signifies when the Earth is literally at its closest point to the Sun in the northern hemisphere, and likewise at its furthest point in the south. The ancients believed that as the sun passed through the gate of Cancer, gate of man, this is the route in for souls to the earth. They come in through this gate, and when we die, we leave through this gate. Likewise, in the night sky, the Milky Way crosses these two constellations, causing them to be cosmic crossroads, meaning that these 2 points are the most magical times of the year. And we can double that up with the spring equinox in Aries and the autumn equinox in Libra. Okay, the moment of birth, the moment of death for the seasons, the moment of birth, the moment of death for the soul. These concepts are really vital to understand, because as we develop, I'll show how each of these decans is associated with spirits from the Grimoire spirit lists, and that the planetary rulerships and the elemental natures of the signs indicate what type of spirits they are from an elemental point of view. This is vital information if you want to pursue Goetia and this school of magic. I hope that was helpful. If you did find it helpful, please give us a like. And if you would like to pursue this, please get in touch and book yourself onto the next course that I'll do. Okay, that's it for now. Thanks very much for listening.